I'm standing over here because if I stood over there, I'd just look out at the beautiful scenery, so excuse me. I didn't say this to Hannah, but you can imagine I've gotten invitations to speak, and I don't accept most of them because they're not serious. But as soon as I saw Norway, I knew Norway would be serious. So thank you for inviting me, and thanking you for showing me this amazing part of the world. First of all, thank you to Hannah and Heidi for thinking of it, and to the County Council of Nordland for making it all happen. I like to think tourism sort of begins at the beginning of this millennium, the modern era. If you can think back to your New Year's Eve on 2000, it was a new century filled with hope. The Cold War ended without a war. Especially you all would have felt that, particularly. Eastern Europe, what we used to call Eastern Europe, it was fine. Something resembling peace was in the air. We thought, woo, this is going to be an interesting 21st century. Now for us in tourism, for the tourism issue, what was astonishing was that borders opened around the world, all over the world. The Soviet Union was Russia again. The Baltic states were independent. China opened up with Russia. Indochina opened. For the first time in modern history, literally, the whole world was open to travel. And this was something no one even thought about at that moment. It was so political. Miraculously, technology would open up the world even further. Airplanes now can travel halfway around the world. The internet puts the open world at your fingertips. Prices went down for travel, and the middle class grew around the world with money to travel. So what could go wrong with this golden era? And that's the subject of your workshop. What went wrong? Because it should be gorgeous. You see the problems in that much-loved destinations and monuments have become overrun. Idyllic islands, historic cities have lost their pristine nature and are trashed. And countries are discovering that tourism is not a hobby. Tourism is not a vacation. It's not a pastime. It is an industry. And that I cannot underline too much. It is a serious industry. It is the biggest employer in the world. No other industry employs as many people as tourism. And the underlying assumption in this workshop is that if you take tourism seriously, you may be able to find a strategy to tame tourism to your benefit. And Norway, one of the reasons I thought it would be cool to come up here, is that you all have a reputation, particularly, I covered international economics. What you did with the oil industry is known worldwide as the best model for taking an industry, regulating it, and making sure the benefit helps the country. So you have one of the rare track records, which is what I'm going to suggest you can do with tourism as well. So let's begin in 1960. If we look a little bit at the history, we can see what your problems are. People were, in 1960, we're still in the Cold War, a small bit of the world was open for travel. We traveled, though. In 1960, there were 25 million trips across international boundaries. 25 million in 1960. People didn't know how to travel. If you remember, if you're old enough, Arthur Fromer, an American, published a red book called Europe on $5 a Day. And that was sort of the beginning of looking at tourism as something a consumer would do, where you looked at restaurants and hotels and things like that. And it's a new way of traveling. Americans learned to eat croissant in Paris and paella in Madrid and fish up here in Norway. And it was a little bit. The middle class could imagine crossing either the Atlantic or the Pacific once in their lives. So that was 25 million in 1960. In 1970, it was 250 million. So you're beginning to see, even within the restrictions of the Cold War, you jumped from 25 to 250 in 10 years. Now go 20 years later, at the very beginning of the end of the Cold War, and it's jumped to 500 million. So 25, 250, 500 million. And we haven't even opened up the borders yet. So this is going to tell you that you should be watching this industry, because even limiting, it was booming. Then globalization opens up, and literally the sky is the limit. Not only were the borders opening up, but with all of these bigger and faster airplanes and no one watching anything, by 2008, it was 922 million trips, and 2012, 1 billion, without even scratching your head. 2012, we were 1 billion. That was very nice for me, because the next year my book came out, which was making this very argument. Last year it was 1.3, and this year it's supposed to be at least 1.4, maybe 1.5, 1.5 billion people looking for something to do around the world. And it has been impervious to problems. The Great Recession of 2008, tourism was the one industry that succeeded. The crises, you can still find tourists in Afghanistan. They are everywhere. They get arrested, they die in stupid accidents, but they keep going. And I haven't even mentioned China. China is the biggest wild card, and I see this here, and you're beginning to see it. You haven't any idea. Just to prepare you a bit, China opened up to allow their own citizens to travel around 2000. Since then, they have become the biggest group of foreign travelers in the world. That's literally overnight. And that is with only 7% of China's 1.3 billion people with passports. A mere 7% of Chinese have passports. What's going to happen when 10 or 15%? So let's start thinking of this, you all. And what are you going to do when they come to this beautiful place? Because I can see, there's every reason to come here. So often, and I love to read these things, often technology is credited with all this. The technology makes this happen. Let's look at cruise ships or Uber or whatever, we'll get into that. But I think what I find is missing in a lot of these conferences is looking at government. Because government is responsible for all of tourism at root. Mostly you think, okay, government, you make tourism videos, you make tourism campaigns, that's what it's about. But think about it. Who gives out visas to visit your country? The very beginning, who gives out the visa? Who determines how many airplanes from which company are landing where? Who gives permission for those new big airports? Who gives permission for those cruise ships that are clogging up the harbor in Bergen? Who decides which lodgings are licensed? I'm talking at all levels of government. Who supports the cultural institutions and events that express who you are, that are Norwegian instead of some American group coming and playing? Who taxes the visitors and distributes that money? And who decides not to tax them? Who's responsible for cleaning up after those visitors? And who pays? Government is at the center, whether it is acknowledged or not. And understanding government will show you the power that you all have as citizens, because it's your government, and this is Norway. As citizens, you have the power to help the government understand what you want and how you want the government to use. So that's your power That's how you can achieve the tourism plans. Now, this doesn't always happen, and in the 2 wonderful days that Hannah and Heidi arranged for us, I saw it. And it's not like I was looking for it, okay? We were at what is described as one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, Utakliv. Is Elder here? I don't see him. National Geographic said it's the most beautiful in the world. That community had to, on its own, raise money just for a dozen garbage cans. That's insane. They don't have support from Oslo or the region or there's no money. And yet, they are overwhelmed with 250,000 tourists every year on this gorgeous beach. That, to me, is astonishing. So that's refusing to accept the responsibility. On the other hand, the next day, we were chugging along in the Reina Fjord, and the complaint was that somebody in Oslo decided to change the ferry schedule without telling them. And so, okay, where's the coordination there? So the government, by neglect and by officiousness, is changing your lives, and you have a voice in all of that. So runaway tourism may be flooding your destinations. What's the plan? And who's in charge? Where does the money go? Always a good question. Who's making money from this? So thinking about you all, I said, okay, this is a country with mountains and nature tourism. And it's a country of great European culture. So I chose 2 different sets of examples to show you what I'm talking about in the world. The first, I'm comparing 2 Himalayan nations, Bhutan and Nepal. And the second will be 2 European cities, Bordeaux and Venice. Now this is Bhutan. Bhutan was a pioneer in one of the issues you just raised, carrying capacity. It's as you know, it's a rather isolated country in the Himalayas, beautiful old culture. And at the beginning of globalization, it was a poor country. It was a developing country. It didn't have a lot of money, but it had a beautiful old, almost feudal civilization. So they actually had some decent leaders who said, okay, we want to use tourism to make money, but we don't want the tourists to overwhelm us. They knew this was a fragile society. So they came up with, on their own, just a baseline for earning money and controlling it, deciding that they only wanted 250,000 people to come, and they wanted them to bring high value and low impact. Treating tourism as an industry, not as being nice to people and letting them visit. This is, I mean, you cannot take a bad picture in Bhutan. It's one of those countries you cannot take a bad picture. People fall in love as soon as they get off the airplane. So they thought, okay, we're gonna have all kinds of visitors, 5-star hotels, travelers with backpacks. We're not gonna be snobs about this, but we're gonna control who comes in. And remember the number of visas. So, and they decided we're gonna ask for money up front. $250 a day for Bhutan, a poor country. And that's gonna include lodging and things, but it's also gonna include a fee, a royal fee that would underwrite their entry into the modern world with education, free healthcare, poverty elimination, and infrastructure. The reading program alone, thanks to tourism money, and remember, we're tourism money, brought the literacy rate in the country from 3% to 60%. Hear that? I defy you to find another developing country that used oil to do that. So tourism is a very serious, wonderful thing if you can do it. So here are the basic requirements. All tours and treks are done through registered travel agents, no freelance. All visits are guided by licensed guides. All tourists are required to wire that $250 that includes the money. And they promise in return that, you know, really excellent occasion. I mean, this is normal. Like you're used to the same, just add a few thousand meters to it and that's it. So does this mean that they made all these requirements? Do you think they lost out? It is probably they can't keep up with the request for visas because they remained Bhutan. They remained Bhutan. The tourism increases are 21%. The receipts are $80 million. They do not have a problem. They do not have to have some go visit Bhutan. They just make money. So it never succumbed to trying to look like something else. I can't read that, but it certainly looks like a beautiful prayer reel. They've remained who they are. And they deliver high-quality experience. It's a democratic nation with a constitutional monarchy. I always like to know what the government is whenever I go there, because then I'll get a sense of it. A king and a prime minister, they are involved, king and prime minister, in the tourism decisions at all levels with the people. And the bottom line is they're trying to, they have employment in it, ecotourism, sustainable tourism, they're trying it all. So this is my big plans, adhere to the plans, sounds radical, works really well. Now Nepal, Mount Everest. Should be even better. Nepal is right down the road. It's large, 20 million people versus this, and 4 times the size of Bhutan. Yet, poor Nepal has suffered numerous political coups, revolutions, and political strife. Poor government. And in the process, that's trash. It's famous for the trash. The poor regulation and planning, and in that breach, mass tourism enveloped Nepal and brought onerous problems. Mountains are overrun with tourists, environmental degradation, increase in inequality, which is really marked when you look at Bhutan. The infrastructure was not caught up with all of these visitors. Electricity is famously bad. And you know, this is a country that has avalanches, natural disasters, and they don't have the infrastructure to help on that. The government has failed to tax tourism to pass the benefits to the country, and the foreign industry, tourism guides and packages, all that sort of thing. The foreigners are making a lot more money than the locals. Tourist goods are imported, foreign companies dominate. And while Nepal welcomed 1 million visitors last year compared to Bhutan's 250,000, it hasn't helped Nepal climb out of poverty. In fact, and this is what really breaks your heart, the wonderful Nepalese, and I've learned that they come and help you in your mountains, 1/3 of the whole country's GDP comes from Nepalese who work overseas. There aren't enough jobs for them in their own country. They have to go overseas and they send in remittances. It's one of the highest, I think the 3rd highest in the world, because this industry is not helping them. And I do Nepal trash, Google it. I just have a few pictures here. And this is what it could be. This is the beautiful side of it. So this to me, to mountainous Norway, tells you that planning, I've heard toilet stories until I'll never forget them. Trash stories here. I mean, you're in the middle of all this. Who's responsible? Who's going to pay for it? Who's listening? And that's the sort of the level that you want to look at. There are really good intentioned tour groups who want to be thoughtful, and a lot of great industry that promises voluntary this, that, and the other, but without that plan, there's going to be a lot of misses. So that's the mountainous side of Norway that I was thinking of. The next side is you have this great culture. And so Venice. Venice started out with probably the biggest advantages of Europe. I don't think there's a more beautiful city I've ever seen in my life. It's just astonishing. You turn a corner and they're masterpieces. It's unbelievable. Treasures in every church, paintings, sculptures, and a city of canals, no cars. I mean, just, it's another world. It truly is another world. And at the end of World War II, it seemed like it had figured out how to be a good tourism spot. Evelyn Waugh called it the greatest surviving work of art in the world. Thomas Mann of course, said yes, but it's half fairy tale and half tourist trap. So, I mean, it's all there, right out there. But tourism helped Venice after World War II recover, because it wasn't hurt during all that horrible war. And it was a population of almost 175,000 people. Remember, 175,000 people, end of World War II Venice. Tourism came, lifted it up. They spent money. They spent money on Murano glass, on Venetian paper. I was lucky enough to be there then. Unbelievable. Artists everywhere. We were all trying to save Venice from the high waters. Saving Venice was cool. Population grows. Then globalization, remember that year 2000, globalization and mass tourism hit. And now, only 55,000 Venetians remain in their city. Tourism was supposed to help it, but tourism, for reasons that you all know, high rents, Airbnb, development that pushes things out for somebody else and not the locals, it eventually made it so Venetians cannot afford to live in their own city and they're moving inland. Meanwhile, remember, 55,000, 24 million tourists visit that little city. Oh, isn't that fun? You have these billboards everywhere. There's barely room the once elegant courtyards are like this. It's become a free-for-all. Regulations exist on book. I mean, if you wanted to, a lawyer could go there and say, oh yeah, these are really great regulations. Nobody pays attention to them. You ask the mayor, as when I went there to report on it, you know, who makes money? The books aren't open. It's essentially a free-for-all hidden by good laws. Citizens are not sitting still for this. They petition. They have fabulous protests. I mean, gorgeous, magical protests. They wear their masks, and it's exciting, but nothing moves. And as the population decreases, you all know what happens. Schools close. Medical clinics close. The green grocer closes. The butcher closes. And it's all pretty soon geared to tourists. So there's souvenir shops where you used to buy your milk. And the place where you used to have the great Murano glass blowers, it's now a Kempsky Hotel. I mean, that's what's happening in Bordeaux. St. Mark's Hotel. The number of tourist dwellings in the last 15 years rose by 450%. Tourist dwellings. Guess what went down by 450%? Local housing. So you have little choice. When you do that, you got rid of your artisans. It's very hard to find real Murano glass. The regulation to requiring that it has to be real Murano is forgotten, and most of it is done in either former Yugoslavia or China. So jobs are disappearing for locals. It's foreign agencies. So, and the reliable jobs are gone, and the benefits aren't transparent. You get visitors from everywhere. Look at the crowds on that boat, on the bridge. The visitors can't even, they're blocking it. So locals are trying to find their way around from what used to be their city. UNESCO, which originally, the UN cultural organization, UNESCO, over a couple of decades ago, had worried that water was going to ruin Venice. Now they say they are now totally concerned that tourism is the one that's drowning Venice, and Venetian citizens are so angry that they have petitioned UNESCO to take Venice off of the heritage because it's no longer being a heritage, it's become a Disneyland. There's a revolt in the making, to put it mildly. Now, to go back to government, it's not just the city. I don't think it's an accident that Italy is one of the more corrupt and poorly governed major countries on the continent. So, you know, your history and your government is not irrelevant in all this stuff. So let's take cruise ships, for example. My husband and I were having breakfast one day in Venice, and from the time the first coffee arrived till the last pastry was consumed, I think we saw 5 dock in this teeny little town, five cars. Each small cruise ship produces the carbon dioxide of 21,000 cars. This is a city without cars. These ships dock, and they keep the motor running. See, look what it's like Godzilla. These beautiful masterpieces of buildings with these cruise ships. That's no much fun. At their height, 2 million cruise passengers docked at the canal, flooding St. Mark's every year. And this is part of the issue. Remember, when you're cruise ships, I'll go back, just because it's so ugly. When you're a cruise ship, you don't go to a hotel. You probably eat on the ship, most of your meals. You're going around on expeditions that are organized a cruise ship, and they generally pay. The local business have to pay the cruise ships to be an exhibition. It's a money under the table, very little to the locals. And the impact is that you get a city center now, which is foreign boutiques, French, Italian, and Japanese. And it's very hard to go to the city center for something to eat. Now, the church. There's now the intrusions on church baptisms, weddings, and funerals by tourists and their guides was so bad that they tried to get the churches to have guards to stop them from coming in. And finally, last November, we're saying 2017, after 17 years of protests, the mayor has finally started to figure out a compromise. They are going to reduce the large cruise ships from docking in Venice within 4 years. No more fast food restaurants in the city center, and no more hotels in his new hotels. And this is what really breaks your heart. The locals will finally be having priority on their own water taxis. They pay for this water taxi service, which is the only way to get around. Remember, there's no cars. You either walk or you take a water taxi. And the tourists were pushing them out so that the citizens could not use their own taxis. And they had to make a new law. Oh, so, and then, this isn't enough. They're talking about a cap and so on and so forth. But this is what happens when you just laissez-faire, let it get out of control. We don't want planning. We don't want to make the industry unhappy. We want to bring as many tourists as we can because it's a lot of money without knowing where the money goes and what it's going to be used for. And, this is me talking to these are the activists, a CPA, a professor. I mean, these are people who are trying desperately to keep their city. Desperately. Bordeaux. Have any of you been to Bordeaux? You love it as much as I do? It's no accident. Bordeaux had all the disadvantages Venice did not. Bordeaux came into the modern world, post-World War II, a mess. While Venice was building up with tourism, Bordeaux had lost its position as the shipping port for France. For 2 centuries, it had been the port to the Atlantic. And it had been one of the wealthiest. It had, Bordeaux wines, of course. And, but all that was left in, the 1990s as the world is opening up, all that was left were a decaying port lining this beautiful city with filthy buildings, abandoned warehouses, highways built across the town with no good thought, and the vintners turning their back on the city. People would visit the wine country and avoid the city. Then, isn't that beautiful? Most people think you see. And then in 1995, this is going to go right back to government. Alain Juppé was elected mayor of Bordeaux. Juppé, this is a homecoming. He had been one of the cleverest, most intelligent national politicians who got caught in his party, Republican Party scandal. He was exiled to Canada for a few months. And then he he was supposed to come back to Paris and resume climbing ministries, becoming president, whatever, and he said no. He said no. He went to his hometown and said, no, I have a new project. I'm going to make Bordeaux, Bordeaux again. And remember, this guy, smart, talented, and had been through the ringer. He knew what politics were. He knew where the money was. He knew where the power was. And so he took that crusty old Bordeaux and turned it back into its 18th century beauty, at the same time putting the city in 21st century with modern, clean, green technology. So you could do both. You can return it to its 18th century beauty with those beautiful electric trams that will take you all over the city, getting rid of a lot of the streets, so it's a lot of pedestrian only. And he did it in one plan. He was not going to do a little bit here, a little bit there. He said, okay, we're going to have one big plan. We're going to dig up the city bit by bit. We're going to, and meetings, maybe you Norwegians could put up with it, but they had meeting after meeting after meeting. What do you want? What do you love? How can we do this? Strong mayor, bottom up. And then also a mayor who knew how to tap money from the EU. You guys aren't in the EU, sorry. Tap money from the regions, tap money from Brussels, of course. And then, voila. And I talked to him about this because I couldn't believe it, because I'd lived in France during the cruddy old days. And I said, so how did you do that? He said he put tourism at the center of his plans. He's not shying away from, look at this. This is all new. I'll tell you about it in a second. But tourism he saw as an economic engine. He saw tourism as the way to bring benefits across the population. That the tourists would rekindle the restaurants, rekindle cultural events. He's built museums. And so it went all the way across, done correctly. He said, literally, it is very, very important that Bordeaux attracts tourists. That is our financial foundation. So he's not saying no to tourism. He's saying we have to be very careful and know what we want, make our city, and then put the tourists in there. Bordeaux is not just like an island in the middle of a country. France is, Paris on down, one of the pioneers of sustainable tourism, and it goes way back. It's because of France that I did my book. I was covering international economics, and in those days, especially Norway would understand this, big trade deals always went around agriculture subsidies and your fishing stuff. So I was in Paris interviewing the deputy agriculture minister. And all of a sudden, at the end of the interview, I said, okay, so why do you have a map of cultural events of France behind you. And he said, everything goes back to tourism. I said, what? He said, no, we organize around tourism. And they've been doing that since the 1930s. Pierre Mendès France, the prime minister, was the first to made France the first country to give paid vacations. So they understood the new rhythm of modern life was going to be time off. And with that, vacation camps and so on and so forth. After World War II, when the United States was giving money for the Marshall Plan, France asked for that money to be used to rebuild their tourism. And then really critically, in 1959, President Charles de Gaulle created the world's first Ministry of Culture. And this is why I chose this as a cultural slide, because culture working with tourism is just as important as nature working as tourism. When the countries that have strong ministries of culture have amazing tourism, because they slide the tourists around the country. Cannes Film Festival was made for tourists. Perpignan's Photography Festival was for tourism. The whole map was, we don't want tourists just in Paris, we want them all over the place. So Lofoten is going to have a film festival that everybody will come to. I don't know. So we're back in Bordeaux. Juppé creates this amazing re-engineering of the city, and the masterstroke was to recover this river. Now imagine this was all warehouses. All warehouses, cruddy, abandoned. The equivalent of 8 lanes of road were cleared, streets gotten rid of. And this beautiful esplanade with a water mirror. At the one end is this world-class skateboard park, another end is basketball courts. The promenade, the city's heart is now this river, whereas before it wasn't there. It's all tied together with that tram system, and Juppé made Bordeaux the first official bike city in France. This was all thinking together, and it is now, as Venice is trying to get out of the UNESCO registry because they're so mad at the city, Juppé got Bordeaux on the registry as the largest urban historic site in the world. It's so brilliant what he did. So, food market. I'm into food markets. They have farm to sea to restaurants that you would die for. And they have subsidies for the farmers, you know, all that stuff that you guys make fun of. They've opened up markets, museums, tourists mingle with locals, and they all pretend they're French for a day. And this was stunning to me. Under Juppé's tourism project, he created this museum. You may not like the architecture, but it's a very cool museum. It's Cité du Vin, the city of wine. And what he did, which seems so obvious but had not happened in 500 years, was he brought these famous vintners. He had to convince them to work with the city of Bordeaux to allow the tourists to go out and look at the vineyards. They hadn't. They had not ever allowed that. So first he showed them that the city was cool and that the city was making money. And then he hired a wine expert. And now they have tastings. 5 years ago was the first tastings in the city of all the wines. And the people who were most happy were the vintners who had never tasted their neighbors' wines. But it's now become this ecosystem that didn't exist before. And the chateaus that said, no, we don't want tourists, they have hired chefs. So they have food for the wine pairings, welcoming visitors. I mean, it's always the obvious that it's the hardest to change. Now, not only this, but you know, a new symphony orchestra. They have the world's and an open city. So I mean, I've just described what sounds maybe a little too regulated plan. You think, oh, it's a little sterile. You should see it's so elegant, the outdoor lighting and lighting signs. There's none of the haphazard coffee shacks and souvenir stands. It's very elegant, and you think, oh, this sounds a little too sterile. Not at all. It's as multicultural as Paris without the insanity. And in fact, there's quarters with tea shops, halal butchers, mosque, and it is so open that Juppé was running for president a few years ago. Emmanuel Macron won, but he was knocked down in one of the first rounds, in part because he was not anti-Muslim, and they called him Ali Juppé. I mean, it's an open city. It's, as you know, it's near Spain and Mediterranean, and he opened it up in a historical way, which did not make everybody happy. He, in the museums, he for the first time ensured that there was exhibits on the past as a slave port, and that the city was built in part on earnings from slavery in the sugar colonies. And he, with exhibits on collaboration with the Nazis, nothing hidden, always heroes of the resistance, so that it's, you see, I'm describing a personality. And that personality was enriched by tourism. The wine came into the story, the history came into the story, and their 21st century. Since being ignored in 1995, it was named in 2015, the #1 most beautiful European city for tourists. Last year it welcomed 6 million visitors, and it has been named the happiest city in France, the greenest, the most biodiverse. I mean, it's just, you can't keep up with it. And it's so popular now with French, not just tourists. There's now an association of Parisians who have moved to Bordeaux. And I didn't quite, you can be blown over by all this stuff, but I didn't understand quite the secret of how this meshes together until I think my last week there, the manicurist was telling me why he had moved from a little village in Champagne country to Bordeaux. And he said he'd heard it was cool, but really what made him really happy and move there was when he registered to vote. And the town hall said, well, here's your invitation for a mayor for coffee. And so he thought, a big crowd like this. He was one of only 20 people. The mayor had coffee with them, talked for an hour. What are you up to? What do you want? So on and so forth. And he said that's a warmer welcome than he'd ever had in any village. So that is Bordeaux. Questions? This beautiful church. So any questions?